2-3, stand by. Goliath, this is 2 Bravo. Request permission to engage enemy paratroopers and attempt to snatch a grid Papa Uniform 259er, 119er. Break. Enemy is unaware of our presence at this time. Over. Solid copy. Hitman 2.
Hey, good morning, everybody. This is Ben Powers coming at you from the Commander's Voice. My guest today is friend of the show, George Luz. We always love having George on, and he's coming to us live from the basement in Hagnow. George, how are you doing?
Great, Ben. How are you this morning? Good to be back.
Doing great. Doing great. So George and I were going back and forth before the show, and I was just reminiscing that the first time he was ever on, he was in this lovely office setting looking like a college professor. And now I get him in the rough and ready basement as though we're getting ready to go out after some Nazis. It's a very fantastic progression.
No, I agree, man. Sitting at a desk, that's not me.
Awesome. And always happy to have you on here, George. So what we're going to talk about today, guys, is something that's not normally addressed when we talk about Band of Brothers, and that's the women. So we all know when you read the book, you watched the miniseries, or you just know about the United States Army in World War II, it was a very different society than we have now. So the Army in general was a very male-oriented culture. You did have the Women's Army Corps, but they were segregated from the men, and they were came on active duty to free up men for frontline positions. But there was no women Army Corps personnel featured in the book or the film. You get to episode 6, Bastogne. There are the nurses, so there are women represented, but very, very briefly over the arc of a 10 episode series. And what we wanted to address today was a little bit more was just how important women were to the Many Easy Company, not just the nurses at Bastogne, although that was certainly vital to all the men who were wounded there, but also the fact that these guys had families, they had sweethearts, they returned home, they married, and they had lives that stretched for decades beyond the war, and they had to deal with the trauma of that war, and the women were there to help them. And all the way down through the current generation, the children, grandchildren of the veterans, and the spouses of those children and grandchildren, and some of them who had their own illustrious military careers, because we've come a long way, as the old cigarette commercial used to say. You've come a long way, baby. And now we've got women in every branch of the military service, and they're serving in every role, to include combat roles. So it's certainly a very different time. So that's a lot, but we're going to kind of jump right into it by going back to the winter of 1944, 1945, and talking about those nurses in Bastogne. So George, take it away.
Yeah, geez, I agree wholeheartedly, Ben. The contribution of the women and wives and stuff like that. I always try to acknowledge that when I do a speech. I'll always just say, 16 million American men and women served during World War II, and so it's great that we're able to kind of do a show like this. And I know we're going to start off with the nurses, and in the series we had the 2 nurses there, Renee Lemire and Augusta Cheevy, and having traveled to Bastogne several times, many times, dozen times, whatever it is, we go and we pay a visit to their grave. And so I want to share just a little bit about them. And most of your viewers probably know this, but I want to repeat it anyway. And in the case of Renee, she was born in Bastogne, and she was working in Brussels as a nurse at the time. And she was visiting her parents in Bastogne, and was surprised by the Germans' last chance offensive. Auguste was originally from Belgium. At the age of 9, she arrived in Belgium at the age of 9, and she was originally from Burundi. Her mother was Congolese, and her dad was an animal veterinarian. Her father returned their family to Belgium, and she began her nursing career when the war broke out. And on December 21st, Renee and Auguste volunteered. Captain Jack T. Pryor, he was a surgeon of the 20th Army Infantry, accepted their help. Together, they set up a temporary medical aid station and provided medical assistance to the American soldiers. And I think we all kind of remember this one here. Captain Pryor in his report explains that on the night of Christmas Eve around 8:30, and the neighborhood was lit up like daylight by the German magnesium flares and that terrible bombardment followed, and one bomb fell directly on the hospital. 30 bodies were extracted from the rubble, including Renee. Dr. Pryor and Auguste survived. Dr. Pryor personally brought the body of Renee back to her parents, wrapped in a parachute cloth that she insisted on being able to save earlier that day, and she wanted to make a wedding dress out of it, she had said. In 1994, the 50th anniversary of her death, a plaque was affixed to the building rebuilt on that site of the medical aid station. Augusta, she was featured and honored for her role in 2011 with the United States Army Civilian Award for humanitarian service, and was knighted by the King of Belgium. At the ceremony, she said, "What I did was normal. I would have done it for anyone. We are all children of God."
That's an amazing testimony right there. And the fact that she just considered it the right thing to do, was not, there for, accolades or, any type of high-minded principle. It was other than the principle of humanity. That's fantastic.
Yeah, the sacrifices that women make, we see it on a daily basis in our lives. And, looking back in history, women have made an extraordinary contribution. And I'm so happy that we're able to do this for them today.
It's just amazing to me that it took 70 years for that service to be recognized with the knighthood and the decoration from the United States Army. And I'm wondering if it was the resurgence of interest in the war brought about by not only Band of Brothers, but a myriad of books, and the fact that people were going back and celebrating the anniversaries of these major engagements, to include Bastogne, that kind of brought attention to her story.
No, you're right. Because when you look at history, there's a lot of books about history, about every war. And I guess, in this particular case, so many of those books have been written and read and enjoyed and admired. And then it's like there's that writer out there that says, there's other stories to be told. And they find these other stories, of sacrifice and heroic efforts and humanity and things like that. And that's where these things come in. And I think, when I'm on tour, I do my usual Band of Brothers speech type thing, and I try to focus on exactly what we're talking about today. And it gets a great response from the women on the tour, that I do acknowledge that.
Oh, that's fantastic. And speaking of, getting a response from the women, so to speak, that's probably my worst segue in the history of this podcast. But the as we've addressed the nurses, but I want to talk about the idea that the men of Easy Company had, female family members, and again, really focus on the wives and sweethearts. And I'd kind of like to start with your mom and dad's story, because I think that you've related that to me in the past offline, and just how they knew each other and how their relationship grew. I just think it's a really neat story. So if we could kind of talk about um, your mom and dad in, pre-war, and then when he got home, and how she supported him over the years.
Well, it's interesting. My dad and his good buddy Tony, they lived right down the road, and so my dad was one of 10, and my mom was one of 12. So my dad and Uncle Tony, good buddies. My dad and Tony are good buddies, and Tony's got probably 8 sisters and 4 brothers, including himself. So, and they were all younger than he was. So, my dad probably looked over and said, "Oh yeah, he's got a bunch of young sisters," kind of a thing. And so when my dad got back from the war, at that point he was 24, and now my mom, who was 5 years younger, was 19, going on 20. So it was a different thing, and they looked. He noticed her at that age. When you're 21 and somebody's 15, it's like you don't look that way. So, but anyway, but at 24, 19. So anyway, they got together, they fell in love, and they had a family. So, so my dad's good buddy Tony ended up being an uncle to me. So.
No, that's awesome. And,
Well,
and Tony was a veteran too, wasn't he? Not to
he
say
was.
to the
He
life of
was.
Tony.
Yeah.
Was where did he serve? I'm just curious.
Oh, he was in the European theater also. Yeah, he
Very
was in the European theater also.
amazing.
And, but yeah, that was kind of neat the way they got together. So, and it's really cool to see all those old pictures of when they were young. I don't know. It's not that the women today aren't glamorous, but it seemed like back in the 40s and the 50s, the women were, I don't know, they were much more glamorous. I don't know what it is.
No, certainly. I think the fashion has something to do with it that the photo I'm bringing up right now, your dad, right, returned back from the war. It looks like he's with two of his sisters, and they're
Oh
they're
yeah, that was that was a
they're
great shot.
dolled up for the Rhode Island winter, but they look like movie stars.
Yeah, and I think we talked about this. My dad had just gotten out of the army, so that was probably around December of 45. And that was Aunt Dorothy to my dad's left, and Aunt Louise to my dad's right. And so that was in the neighborhood. That was in the shadow of the old homestead, as we call it, which is still there today. And we drive by and look at it and say, hey, a lot of pictures were taken, whether it was against the garage. It seemed like the garage was a perfect place to take a picture. So there's a lot of pictures of us, the family, taken with the backdrop of the garage, but this one was in the road and you can kind of see the garage in the background. So
No, that's awesome. So with your mom and dad, it's post-war, they get married, and we've previously done an episode on the reunion culture of Easy 506, and they started their reunion and their association post-war very early, and it seems as though the wives formed their own bond through those reunions as they got to know each other and kind of shared experiences of some helping their husbands process what they went through during the war. So, and your mom started attending reunions pretty much right away, right?
yeah, I think the first reunion was in 1946 in Indianapolis. And I'm not sure exactly which one my mom and dad went to first, and I'm sure they went to a couple of them, but we've got that photo from 1956. There's a photo there from Webster's home. There's a photo from several of the reunions, and the women always had a presence there, and it was great. They were creating their own relationships with the wives. And hey, let's face it, these guys, in this case, these guys had saw war. They saw some awful stuff, and they all came home in different stages of being broken, built up, broken, built up, and so the wives played a crucial role in allowing their husbands going on these trips, provided they take their wives. Well, and I know in my case, some of the guys came by themselves, but most of the guys, they brought their wives along. And so it was great because I got a chance to meet a lot of the wives too, and um, the role that they played is so significant that we see that carried on to this day.
No, Roger that. Now, the I think a lot of the folks who would tune into this podcast who would just enjoy the whole Band of Brothers, culture at this point would kind of identify that the men at Easy Company were sort of a rough and ready bunch. In your experience going to the reunions, when things would get a little fun, a little rowdy, a little crazy, did the wives uh, have any kind of tempering influence on the hijinks, or did they just kind of tolerate the guys letting their hair down and reliving their past?
Well, I'm sure if it was probably back in the hotel room, but but no, most of the guys kept it together. You always had somebody who maybe drank a little too much in the hospitality or something like that. But I'm sure the wives, if any of that was going on, it was going on in the room. There wasn't any overt, fingers in the face. You better mind your P's and Q's here. So I do remember, I do remember my mom talking about Walter Gordon, and Walter wasn't a drinker, and so he enjoyed on Saturday at a lot of these reunions. He would take a bunch of the women out to lunch. And I always remember my mom talking about that as it being one of the really neat things that they did because it got them out of the hotel. It got him out to another restaurant and wasn't just stuck in the hospitality room. So yeah, Walter played a really neat role and doing that. And I know my mom always appreciated that. And I'm sure the rest of the women did as well.
Oh, that's fantastic. And just kind of allowing them an opportunity to bond in their own space as well is really cool.
Yeah. It
And
was,
and speaking of those bonds, I know we've addressed this in the past as well, but I think it bears repeating in this context that over time, Barbara Webster and your mom formed a really nice relationship.
yeah, Barbara was terrific, and after the reunion, it was really after the premiere, it was really neat. And she sent my mom this letter. Let me read just a little bit of it. And hey, let's face it, the premiere was just a unbelievable event.
Certainly.
So this was after the premiere in 2001. So she says, "Dear Dell, have you come down to Earth yet? I haven't. Wasn't that the most fabulous trip ever? So enjoyed meeting you again, and to think our late husbands were friends. Enclosed is a picture I had made for you and your George. Keep well, take care. Best wishes to you and your family, Barbara Webster Emery." And so that photo is the one that was taken in 1956 at their home at the reunion. And it was on September 1st. Yeah, September 1st. And the crazy thing was, I was born in 1956, in July of 1950. I think we've talked about this before. July of 1950, July 24th to be, cards and letters, but July 24th, 1956, I was born. And then, 5 weeks later, they were their way to Los Angeles from Rhode Island, which is a long way in 1956, but they flew and actually they got there. And so anyway, it's really cool. And in that photo, you'll see my dad. I think there's a guy, he's on the, let's see, C.T. Smith, he, my dad, Ed Tipper, Barbara Webster's in that photo as well. Chuck Grant is also in that photo, and then a bunch of the kids. And then so she puts this whole thing all together, and as she said, "This is one of my favorite all-time photos. I wish we could go back and do it again, so we could pay more attention and hold each one a little longer."
That's a really nice sentiment. Wow.
Yeah. So, the older we get, I think the more we realize how every moment in life is important.
Yes, sir. And that's an amazing photo too. Just not only does it illustrate the bonds of the families and how even 10 years after the war they're still together, but that roll call you just named off, there's a lot of heavy hitters in that particular photo from Easy Company. That's pretty amazing.
Yeah,
So
good stuff.
one thing I wanted to talk about further is as we are talking about the reunions and we're talking about the families and how things occur generationally, you've got more than one veteran in your family to honor. I mean, you got Uncle Tony, obviously you've got your dad, but Mrs. Luz is a veteran in her own right, and she kind of illustrates the progress that we've made towards equality and the opportunities put forth for women in the armed forces. So I'm not sure. First off, I'm not sure Miss Susan would be thrilled we're talking about her. But secondly, uh, if you could kind of relate to the audience just the amazing military career that your wife has had.
Yeah, she is amazing. When she got out of college in the early 70s, she wanted to join the Army and go to Vietnam, but her dad wouldn't let her go because he knew that in World War II, even nurses were killed. So she joined the Peace Corps. So she was delivering babies in Brazil. After that, she went into the Project Hope. It was called the Ship Hope back in the day. And then at age 33, she joined the military. And so for 27 years, she was in the Army Reserve in the Medical Corps, Combat Support Hospital. And she did a lot of the annual trainings. She did all the annual trainings, which brought her to one faraway country after another for just several weeks at a time. But she's been all over Central America and South America and Europe and things like that. And then in her last deployment 2004, no, 2006, 2007, she was deployed at 57 years old to Iraq, like many others, like yourself. So
We
she
were at the
spent,
same time.
isn't that so? So she was in Mosul. She started out in Mosul, and then they transferred that part of her unit to Al-Assad. And it was just prior to the surge. And so they needed to construct a level 1 hospital, I think they call it. And the other unit was in Tikrit. Half the unit was in Tikrit, the other half was in Mosul, and then they got switched to Al-Assad, and then which was the Marine base. Now Marines are different than Army, and
To say
and
the least.
and then you got to remember too that the Army Medical Reserve is different than Army Medical full time, so it's a different animal. I think the reserve, they're in the field every day, whether they're working in hospitals and doing this and doing that, all kinds of stuff. Not that the full timers aren't doing as much, and they certainly were, but the reserve really play a huge role in the medical part of it.
Oh,
And
absolutely, no doubt. The level of trauma and the variety of things that civilian or reservists, I should say, will see in their civilian medical careers, and that translates directly into being able to support a combat support hospital is just invaluable.
You're right. You're exactly right. And so anyway, so she did her 15 months, a couple of months at Camp McCoy in Wisconsin, and then 12 months in country, and then another short stint back in Camp McCoy, and then she arrived home, and then she did a couple more years, and then at 60 she cashed out. But they want you to. In some cases, she had a triple MOS. So they wanted her to stay an extra couple of years, and she just said, "Nah, you know what? My work is done. My time is up, and let's pass the baton." So she retired at 60 as a colonel,
Yeah,
06.
yeah, that's amazing too. I think your dad would find that fabulous that his daughter-in-law is the same rank as his regimental command.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. My dad was very proud of her, and her dad was very proud of her too, because Susan's dad also served in World War II. He was in Patton's army.
Oh, wow. What an
Yeah,
amazing legacy of service. And
yeah.
that, like, Miss Susan is definitely an amazing soldier and an amazing medical professional. And I think it's just kind of cool that we kind of start this discussion about, volunteer nurses kind of coming out of the woodwork doing what they can. And then we have this evolution over time where now they're, established parts of the military hierarchy and are able to bring their talents to bear in an organized fashion. And I think that's just really cool.
Yeah, you look at the leadership that they can provide, the steady leadership that they can provide, and another perspective that they can provide. And it's all about mission, and they understand that. So, my wife is still connected with her dear friends, and they get together on occasion, and on the phone, and in person, and I'm kind of blessed to be able to be involved in a sense with my wife's group also. She was in the 390 when she was their last deployment was with the 399 Combat Support Hospital. And so she's still connected with a lot of them. And so I'm blessed to be able to just listen to some of their stories. And you know how it is when you guys get together and you talk about your stories, there's a lot of humor in all the stories. So, they're not talking about all of the awful things. They may swerve into them here or there, but they're talking about what brought them all together.
No, exactly. And the good memories are what keeps everybody bonded. That's certainly for sure. So you made an inference towards the fact that your dad was super proud of her, and rightly so. I'm assuming that she's attended reunions with you, over the years. Did the men of the company know that she was an officer? And if so, did they react differently? Like, oh, the officer didn't look like that in my day, kind of stuff. Or like, what was the reaction?
Well, especially guys like Bill and Babe, Bill and Babe especially. But I remember Buck Compton Buck Compton, we were on a, Susan was deployed. I'm not sure if we ever talked about this. Susan was deployed in Iraq. The Army reached out to us to bring the Band of Brothers to Germany for a unit that was going to be shipping out again. And so one of the enlisted guys drove me to Landstuhl to pick up Susan because she had to be there. She came back to the unit. She came back to the group. She spent about 5 days with us, with the men. And I remember walking along with Buck Compton, and he looked at me and he said, "George, I see you married up." So anyway, so that was cool. That was cool. And the guy certainly respected that, respected her, having served, and to reach the office of colonel. Now she could have become a general, but it wasn't about the rank as much as it was about the soldiers. And in order to be a general, you've got to kind of climb a certain way. And I remember her telling me stories that at the end of each day when she was deployed, they would go back to the hospital and see the soldiers who were in there all banged up. And where other people were on the computer doing this or doing that, trying to take a class or whatever, it's like, that wasn't her.
That's amazing. And just to be able to have that heart and compassion to, deal with the trauma in your professional life, but then donate more time just to go check on the soldiers and see how they're doing, because that certainly takes a certain kind of courage to be able to, put on a happy face and bring some joy to guys who are all busted up like that.
Yeah, and that was another thing. Reminds me of my dear friend Marat Brooks at HBO sent a bunch of stuff, DVDs and this and that and all this other stuff. And then my buddy John Ford, he just sent boxes and boxes of Girl Scout cookies. So anyway, to Susan. Well, they sent it to me and then we sent it to Susan. So anyway, she would use that stuff for bargaining stuff. So she would get stuff from the National Guard unit that was in charge of the food or something like that. And so she would barter this stuff, Tony Soprano, Tony Soprano DVDs or something like that, and then get all this food and steaks and all this other stuff. And then she would share it with, because you know how it is at the end of each day, you'd go back to your chew or whatever it was, and they would have a barbecue and they would kind of share it with everybody who they could share it with. So,
Oh, that's awesome.
so that was kind of neat. And then they just hand out, boxes of Girl Scout cookies are kind of a cool thing.
No, that's really awesome. So one other aspect of women supporting their husbands, and I don't want to give the audience the impression that, women are only good for supporting their husbands. I get it. Everybody, especially in this day and age, can live their life as they see fit, have the career they see fit, and Miss Susan's a great example of that. But in almost like bringing things full circle, uh, when the miniseries was being filmed and the actors were kind of going through it, uh, they got a lot of support from their wives as well, and the actors and the actors' wives kind of became part of the family. You share a little bit about that?
Well, yeah, that's the great thing, because you got to remember a lot of about half of the actors were from the U.S. and the other half was from in Europe. So these guys were away from home for a period of time, and I was able to really get a chance to visit with the wives on several of the events put on by the World War II Foundation, Tim Gray, and at the World War II Foundation. We would create these events in Europe where we'd bring a bunch of the actors together, and on several of them, they were able to bring their wives along. And it was really neat to see the work, the camaraderie that they had built as well. And I know Michael Cutlitz has done a wonderful job out in California, where he has an annual reunion too for the actors and the wives, and naturally play a huge role in that, and the wives and the kids. So it's really cool to see how um, a bonding of a group of people under the same premise, the same story, so to speak, can come together. And it's really pretty cool stuff.
No, that's awesome. And the kind of to wrap things up, You've also had some interesting experiences with families that, while associated with the 101st, associated with the ETO, uh, were not necessarily tied in with Easy Company. And you actually have some nice experiences with the families from the another renowned 506 element, the Filthy 13. So can we kind of wrap up with some Filthy 13 stories?
Yeah, well, it was really great. Jack Agnew, Jake McNeese, and that whole crowd. I went to a reunion one time in Toccoa, and they played a large role there. It was just fantastic. It was fantastic to see them, to meet them, to listen to their stories, and and then once again on one of the other meeting the wives there, and then meeting them at the Reading Air Show in Pennsylvania, great air show, meeting them at the Reading Air Show and listening to them every morning when we would get up for breakfast. I would go sit with the wives because the men always had guys sitting there, guys always had to run it, listening, hey, listening to every story. And it's like, yeah, let me go hang with the wives. So I would just kind of hang with the wives and then just listen to them, because they all had cool stories too.
Oh, no doubt. And,
Yeah.
and they had probably heard every war story 100 times, and they probably knew where to throw the BS flag as well.
That's true. That's true.
No, hey, George, thank you for coming out again. And I think this is a rarely discussed, rarely explored aspect of Band of Brothers. And I'm really happy that you're able to come on today and kind of shed a little light on the love and support that the women of Easy Company were able to provide their paratroopers. So, and the legacy that is carried on through the past 80 years. So thank you so much for coming on today. It's always a pleasure to have you. Guys, this has been Ben Powers coming at you from the Commander's Voice. And as always, with the irrepressible George Luz. So George, once again, thanks for coming on today.
All right, Ben, thank you.